Hey y'all, well, this is the second segment that I've done on vintage cameras, which is a little offshoot from my main channel, and hope y'all find this interesting. Today we're going to be doing early Pentax, and by that I mean pre-1960. And you can't talk about early Pentax without also talking about Sears Roebuck, who brought these models into the US under their own Tower brand, which is what these three are and one of these is. And in Japan, these were sold as Asahiflex, but in the US, they were sold as just a tower. And there was a 23, a 22, and a 24. And we'll get into the differences of those. And then in 1958, same time they were selling the 22 and I think the 23. I think they had dropped the 24 at that point and replaced it with the 22. Which seems kind of weird. But yeah, Leica did the same thing. The later version of the M's had a lower number, so I guess that was just kind of a common thing back then. Anyway, the same time they were selling these, they introduced the Tower 26, which was the OG Pentax SLR. And we'll get into that later on in the video. These little ones are M37 mounts, which have a 37mm thread, and there was a very limited number of lenses. They had a 100mm and a 135. They also had a 83mm f1.9, which is a really rare lens and something I don't have in my collection yet. I'm not sure I'm ever going to deal with that because I do have the M42 mount of that also rare lens, which we'll get into when we start covering these. So, as you can see, this is some really early stuff. This was just the beginnings of the Japanese cameras into the US market. And Sears really was kind of the forerunner on bringing these Japanese cameras in front of the American public. And there's another camera that they brought that we'll cover in another video that was a rangefinder. It's a really awesome camera too. But for now, we're going to stick with the Pentax family. And one of the reasons I got kind of obsessed with these tower cameras, my dad used to work for Sears Roebuck. And so there's that whole kind of family, relationship or history as part of my camera collecting hobby. And so I've kind of enjoyed diving into collecting these tower cameras. I've got the Sears specialty catalogs from that era that shows what was available and that kind of thing, and that really helped me kind of fill out my collection on what was even available at that time. And I'll show you some pictures out of these catalogs too, which I think is very interesting. So let's get into doing some close-up videos of these cameras and their features and the differences between them and the timeline. And we'll go through these M37 cameras and then go into this pair of early SLRs with the eye-level prism, which pretty much established what film cameras or 35mm SLRs were going to look like from then on. So we're going to start off with this little Tower 23, and I've identified this as a late 1954 through the spring of 55 version. The earlier ones, the lens, this part in here would have been chrome. And the later ones, they would have had a little blank right here on the front where the slow speed wasn't installed on this cheaper version of the camera. These were about a $75 camera. This one has the slower f3.5 lens, and it's 50mm. And as you can see, it's got a little rangefinder window here for eye level viewing, but then it also has, in the SLR part, it has this waist level finder. You can look through there and see the image through the lens. It's got a little magnifier that pops up to help you with focusing. So this was through the lens focusing rather than a rangefinder camera. Also, the early ones, these little blades here would be black instead of chrome. And as you can see, let me spin it around here, 71601 serial number, which fits in the range of what it should. Plus it has 2 flash sinks. The really early ones only had 1. And it's got the Leica style shutter set where the shutter speed rotates as you wind. So you need to wind the camera and then you lift and turn to set the different shutter speeds. And on these, the mirror stays up as long as you have the shutter button pushed, and then as soon as you release the shutter button, the mirror flips back down, so you don't have the blackout like you had on some SLRs until you wound to the next frame, which was a big improvement that they did on these little cameras. So the next one we're going to look at is a Tower 24, and this is around the same vintage. I think this is a slightly later one, but it still doesn't have the blank off here, and the serial number does still fit in the range of a 1954 through spring of 55. But as you can see, it's a couple of thousand further down the range. This is the Tower 24. This one has the faster f2.4 58mm lens. And again, this one's black in here. And on this one, this trim's black. Where on the really early ones, all that was chrome. I don't believe that they had this lens, though, before this model. And it functions the same way. Winds. You set the shutter speed here. And it goes down to a 25th of a second plus bulb. There's no slow speeds on this camera. And it has the same little opening thing here for you to focus through. On the bottom, it does have this release lever that releases the film so that you can wind it, and this little thing pops up to make it a little easier to turn, and then sits back down. And this little part will come off as well, and you can put a cable release with external threads that would screw onto that part to have a external cable release in case you had a tripod for time exposures. So the last one I have in this series is the top end model, the Tower 22. And on this one, it does have slow speeds here on the front. And it also came with the faster 58mm f2.4 lens. It's got the same focusing system with the external finder for eye level shooting. And then you focus through here first. And then, let's see, I'm trying to remember if the slow speeds work on this camera. Sometimes these older models, it goes down to a half a second, and let's see if we get lucky here today. There it goes. So, yeah, got your slow speeds here. Like, see here, you set it to this 25 to a half a second, and then it's got a 1/5 of a second, a 1/10 of a second, or a 25th, and then obviously it's got the higher speeds as well. It goes up to 500th of a second, which back then was a pretty fast shutter speed. So let's look at the lenses that were available for these cameras. There weren't a whole lot of them. There was this really pretty, which all of the lenses for these cameras are really pretty. They're solid brass, they're real heavy. This was a 100mm f3.5. This was the first accessory lens that they made for these cameras. The other one I have is an equally gorgeous, if not more so, 135mm f3.5. And again, these are an M37 mount, which is smaller than the Leica 39mm and was unique to this camera. And the only lens that I'm missing in my collection is they made a 85mm f1.9. I haven't been able to source one of those that's in even usable condition. Most of the ones I see are just, the front elements just trashed on them. So obviously they had a very soft coating, and they're a relatively rare lens anyway, and they're usually around $1,000 on the used market. And so Just haven't really pulled the trigger on one of those yet. So next, let's look at my SLRs. We have the Tower 26, and it came with this same 58mm f2.4, and this was before they had the automated aperture. And if you're a Pentax fan, you will note that there's no little flapper thing down here in the bottom of the mirror box to trigger the aperture pin that would normally be on the back of the lens. And again, this was before that was introduced. And so all of these lenses that were made for this camera had what's called a preset aperture. And what you would do is you would set the aperture with this ring here, and then when you flip this little ring back and forth, it goes to whatever aperture that you stop the lens down to. You can see it. So like if you set this to f22, when you flip this ring, stop the lens down to f22, and then afterwards you'd open it back up manually. And it was easier than trying to like manually set this. So some of the earlier SLRs, you just manually set the f-stop and it just set it there. And this allowed you to open the lens up for focusing and then flip the ring to stop it down. So this is the Tower 26, and then here's the Pentax branded version of the same camera. This one's got a little different lens. This has got the 55mm f2.2, and there were a couple of different 50mm lenses that they made for this camera, but this was just one of the other ones. The 58mm was kind of a holdover from the Asahiflex days, and this was a newer design. It's still got the stop down ring here like that one did, or the preset thing. And on this camera it has the same rotating shutter speed dial that you lift up, turn to set the different speeds, but these do have slow speeds. All of these do. And that's 1/125th. Let's see if the slow speed would work on this camera. These actually go down to a second. And these are some of the smoothest winding cameras I've ever used. And I just love the way this wind lever is sculpted. It just really fits your thumb nice, and it just, oh, 1 second's not working. Oh no, that was T. So let's see if 1 second works. There we go. It sounds beautiful. And it's also got this T or time setting that will hold the shutter open until you wind the camera again, which obviously would be for a super long exposure on a tripod, probably for scientific kind of uses and that sort of thing. But again, just a gorgeous camera. It's got 2 flash sinks. Let me show you what the inside looks like. And this one's got a pretty nice curtain. Some of these end up with holes burned in them, or just, you know, they get a bunch of problems, or they get super wrinkled. This one does have a little wrinkle right here. I don't know if you can really see it, but it doesn't affect the way it operates. You can see, perfectly working camera, which is awesome for being this old. I had both of these redone by the Pentax man himself, and I'll have to, I can't remember what his name. I'll put it like down here on the video in the window what the guy's name is that rebuilds these things, and I'm not sure if he's still even doing it. He was trained by the factory, and he rebuilt all these cameras for me, and you know, CLA'd them so that they would work into the future. But both of these SLRs worked just off eBay. They were still operational, and the leather's still in beautiful shape. The black paint's really pretty. I mean, whoever owned these definitely showed them some love, and no dents in them or anything. The chrome's all still really nice, and these were like 1958 vintage cameras, so that's a long time for a camera to still look this nice. So let's go over the lenses. So here's another one that was available. It's a 58mm f2. Again, it's got the preset aperture ring. And there was, I think this was probably one of the later ones in the series that were made for these cameras. And then after this, they all had the automatic aperture button on them, which if you want to use one of those on these early cameras, it's kind of a pain because it doesn't do this little quick stop down ring here that makes these so much easier to use on these cameras. These lenses are also really great to use on adapters, and that's one of the reasons they've gotten kind of rare and expensive is the people that shoot these lenses on adapters on mirrorless digital cameras have learned that these preset lenses make shooting a lot faster and easier. So next we have the first wide-angle lens made for an SLR by Pentax, and it's a 35mm f4. This one, for some reason, is not a preset lens. It just has the aperture ring, changes the f-stop. It's kind of hard to see probably down in there, but you can see how small the rear element was. This was a super early wide-angle lens, not the sharpest knife in the drawer. The later f3.5 was better optically, but I wanted to have this early lens to go with my collection of these early preset Pentax lenses. Next we have the 100mm f2.8, which is a really nice lens. It's got beautiful bokeh or out of focus. It's also has the preset thing going on with it, which makes it great for use both on a mirrorless and on these early Pentax cameras. And this was just a really nice lens that was made for these early SLRs. Next we have the 135 f3.5, and this was another pretty common lens. Again, this is the early preset version. It has the extra ring here. All these are just super smooth feeling. After all these years, they're still just a joy to use. And you can see on these larger aperture ones, the rear element starts getting bigger on the longer focal lengths, but it's still well within what this lens mount can handle, which, like we covered with the Topcon, that was one of the problems with that camera was the small lens mount. And this is the longest focal length I have in these early lenses, and I'm not sure the exact vintage of this one. I do know that this one has got a really early serial number. It's got a 6-digit serial number, which the later ones had 7-digit serial numbers. And it's also got the preset aperture ring like the other ones did, so you can be used on these early cameras. And it's got a 67mm front thread, and this was another really super nice lens. It comes with a tripod mount because it's a pretty heavy beast, and it's got the early style metal front lens cap. But now to the gem of my collection, or I feel it is, and this is a really rare lens. This is the 83mm f1.9. They didn't make a lot of these, and these were an expensive lens when they were new. And this is the preset version. After this, they had the type with the aperture pin that was a more normal 85mm instead of the 83mm. But this is the only one that has the preset aperture ring, so it'll work with these early lenses. And this is an M42 mount version. Like I said, they also had an M37 version of this lens for the earlier Asahiflex cameras that I don't have in my collection. Eventually probably going to try to hunt one up, but I was super glad to find this one. It was actually at a fairly reasonable price. It wasn't cheap, but it still was fairly reasonable, and this was just in mint condition. So really, really cool rear lens that you're just not going to see very often. There's actually some books on Pentax cameras that weren't even sure that this lens was actually ever made, and it took a while for some of these to actually surface once the internet came live, and then people started seeing them for sale. But before the internet, when it was just like used camera stores, people questioned if these were ever even made. So, kind of go over here real quick too. Here's some of the lens caps for the early Asahiflex cameras. And then they kind of moved on to this style. Here's a little plastic one. And then they went with the more common Pentax looking ones like this. Of course, the later cameras, they went with this plastic style with the little pinch things. And then I do have a couple of original OG Pentax filters. This is a super early one with the chrome trim. That's a nice orange color for black and white use. And that kind of wraps up the video here on my early Pentax stuff. And let's wrap it up here. Well, I hope you found this segment on early Pentax cameras interesting. Kind of hard information to find. A lot of people focus on like the Spotmatics and the whole, series that started in the 1960s. You don't see a lot about these really early SLRs, and especially about these Asahiflexes. And it did take me a while to collect all these preset lenses that were designed around these SLRs. And at some point I'm probably going to try to fill out my M37 collection with that last lens. But like I said, they're really rare. Haven't seen many of them. And when I do see them, they're in really bad shape. I think the front coating on the first element was really soft, because all the ones I've seen, the front element looks like a ice skating rink. And so kind of holding out till I find a nice one. But anyway, if you enjoyed this camera collection kind of video segment on my channel, please like the video. Please comment below on, if you're enjoying this, and if you want to see maybe the next kind of range of these cameras, or go back in time and do some early Leica stuff, or, I do have some later stuff too, but I think this early stuff is more interesting to me as far as doing videos on, and there's not a whole lot of this content on YouTube. So again, if you enjoyed this, please like the video, comment, subscribe to the channel. Thanks to all you Patreon folks, and also you folks that make donations to my website. They keep the channel rolling. And until next time, have a nice day.